Yeah, there's big stories that dominate the news, but when you go forward and think, well, what's our bread and butter? Our bread and butter is, as we say, the financial market is a lot of the cycle, as Stephen says. The high frequency, as they say, data that comes out each minute or hour or day or monthly. There's a lot of that. Then there's the structural thing, and then there's the structural thing, and then there's policy that runs off that cycle. So Reserve Bank Board meeting tomorrow, so we'll put a lot of attention and read those sort of tea leaves, and Warwick will be involved in that. And then you get a number of big structural issues, the ETS being one of them. Have we chosen, I think probably Stephen's right on this, that there hasn't been a debate, for example, in Australia, proper debate on, was an emissions trading scheme the right debate, or should we have had a carbon tax? I think there's historical reasons for that, but we haven't really had that debate, and now we've found it's reached almost there, and the political consensus has just blown up. So sort of thinking, why has that happened, and where do we go from here?
Because no one understands it.
I think that is an interesting thing that, and I saw one of the tabloids try to explain on the weekend. I thought they didn't do a very good job. In fact, they got something wrong. I'm not having a go at them, but I think it is fascinating that amongst all this flood of information, the massive public have got no idea. Now, maybe they didn't have a great idea about the GST either, but they've got a very low level of understanding about.
Well, I guess that's our fault, isn't it, as journalists? I mean, it's a relatively easy thing to do to punt on the direction of interest rates and such. I mean, it's 50-50 chance. I mean, it's an easy thing to write about. I mean, is that the problem? I mean, because at the end of the day, our job is to communicate. Yeah. We've got to take complex technical language and deliver it in a simple way that people can understand.
And the problem with the ETS is that it's been intrinsically a political issue, and so it's been reported through the prism of the horse race in Canberra rather than actually looking at it as a policy which will have real effects on real people's lives. And that's where maybe Michael and I do need to step in, and economics journalists do need to step in and pick it apart. But I come back to that issue. Now, I wouldn't entirely agree that economic journalists ignore people and don't focus on issues that matter for people.
Well, that's what they found in the US. I'm not saying it's necessarily the case here, but that was the concern about the reportage of economic and business issues.
Part of it is actually, part of what defeated us with the GFC was the complexity. And Babcock and Brown, I understand, internally had as a motto, complexity is our friend, and it was. And the same for the global banks. It was until it brought them undone. But as a reporter filing for general outlets, it's a bit different if you're dealing with very specialist business press. But as a reporter filing for general outlets, it was a hard sell, the growing risks building up. I tried to get a story up on securitisation and the growing risks internationally with securitisation. And I just got cut short, and I tried to explain in simple language. As soon as I actually said the word, hand went up from the CP. He said, "You are not doing a story for my program that involves that word." And so we've got to pick through, a whole lot of jargon and the fact that there was a lot of fancy financial footwork being done using complex financial instruments meant that it was a hard sell picking this apart in the lead up to the crash, and that's one of the issues that you face as a journalist trying to sell those stories. And the other general criticism I've made, Michael's suggested, it'd be really nice to hear from you, hear some questions or brickbats or bouquets. But journalism is too event driven, and that's partly why we get the coverage of those stats and numbers. And of course you have to cover events, but you have to go beyond covering events, because as soon as events become everything, you get the victory for the PR industry, because politicians and business groups and unions, guess what? They create events for us to cover.
Well, I just want to ask about that before I throw open. I don't know if people do have some questions for our two-person panel. Too bad Annabelle's not here just to keep up the
cracks and jokes.
Yeah, cracks and jokes and such. But my last question is, because kind of like in mainstream journalism, what we're seeing now in economic journalism is that the lines are being blurred between reporting and commentary and analysis. You guys are not only called upon to sort of, interpret the data, but to give an opinion now is what it will mean for the economy. for jobs, for interest rates, etc. I mean, is that a good thing in your view?
Well, I think you have a role for straight reporting, and you have a role for sort of informed analysis, and you have a role for straight out opinion. I think this is the world. I think this is what people say is happening. This is what's been reported is happening. This is what people are saying this means, and this is the way I think of what it means and the way the world actually is. Bugger you. This is what I think.
That's needed more in economic journalism?
I think it's needed more. I think there's a role. There's a role for all
of
of it, and the sort of way I see it is, you just want to tell a bit of a yarn that makes sense of what's going on.
But do you lose some of your independence, being able to step back and not being identified with any particular economic ideology, because economics is driven by ideology as much as politics?
I think basically now the issue, my main framework would be is I think probably need to defend a lot of the reforms of the 80s. Sometimes I have to slap myself and say, well, let's not just sort of defend all the reforms of the 80s over and over again, but they've sort of lost their way a little bit. They're not, especially out of the GFC, not so sure where they're going. So a lot of my framework will be about, well, what are we doing now that makes sense in terms of all those things that paid off, and then in terms of historically where we're at. And I think that we're at the verge of probably a new decade or two growth era in the Australian economy that will fundamentally change the nature of the Australian society, teeing off what's happening with the critical mass of China and in India. And we're starting to see it, so we get this huge growth thing that's going to confront us. We've just been through GFC and lack of demand, but this huge growth thing, and then this huge structural adjustments that are going to occur in that. So I'll just want to tell what's going on within that broad framework.
What do you think?
Well, I think, Michael has a particular role. His role is commentary, opinion, analysis, and he's got a couple of reporters working for the Australian in the economics domain who will do more straight news generally. And it's a good thing. It's a good thing that he's there. Now, anyone who listens to me and reads Michael knows that we've got some different perspectives on some issues. But you need, regardless of that, you need the analysis. You actually need senior journalists doing analysis. And one of the mistakes that happened, I think, also was a tendency to treat people working in markets as authorities, and even people, with all respect to the Reserve Bank, and I have tremendous respect for the Reserve Bank, our key economic institutions of that kind as authorities, and just we had over a period of time too much what I call passive recipient journalism, where there wasn't enough analysis or criticism or digging and delving to find out what was really happening, and too much of he said this, she said this, I said nothing. And I don't think that that's good journalism. And within public broadcasting, that happened to an extent because when the Iraq War was on and the government made 66 complaints about coverage on the Iraq War on AM, and had a real deluge of complaints about the ABC's functioning, that led to a conservatism and passivity in the management because they didn't want to deal with the complaints. And so there was a tendency to reward journalism that was very bland, passive, just reporting what other people said and not attempting to actually get through. And the problem there is the world is full of spin. And if that's the journalism you do, you just end up being a mouthpiece for spin. And you can have a perfectly balanced story, which is basically two lots of bullshit balanced against each other. And we don't need that. We actually need, from different perspectives, but we need analysis, we need skepticism, we need questioning, we need tough journalism that asks questions of people in positions of authority.
Well, any questions from the floor? Do we have time for them? Eric, I can't find you.
Doesn't Gary Banks have one for you, Steve?
Welcome.